Good evening, everyone. My name is Mani. My full name is Manikandan Ramakrishnan, but you don't have to worry trying to pronounce that. So I work with Francois as a data engineer in the data science team, and one of the necessities for the projects with data science often is you have a lot of data in some place, and you need to use those that data in some other places. So you can create dashboards, or you can create dashboards, or you can create some applications, but there has to be a way to connect these data sources into the data clients. So REST API is a very good way of achieving that. So what you can achieve with REST API is basically to connect a data source with a data client. For instance, the use case for us was that there is a data dashboard, and we can do all sorts of data manipulations on the dashboard, and there is a separate application that could really benefit from the data manipulations that were done on this particular dashboard. So in order to bridge those two points, REST API was really a best fit for the situation. The reason is REST APIs are usually pretty simple to design and build, and they are extensible. You can add any number of clients. For instance, now that we have a REST API to bridge a dashboard and a client, we can extend it to multiple data sources. So let's say we just define how the REST API gets the data and how it gives you the data. So we can design any number of we can add any number of data sources to handle the REST API, and we can also add any number of clients to use the REST API to get the data from the data sources. So that is one of the advantages, and it is also compatible. You don't have to worry about for instance, your data is you have coded the whole thing in Python. There is another dashboard that is in Java, so you don't have to worry about the compatibility. All you have to do is to send out the data, call the REST API in the format it knows, and that's basically just JSON. You just call REST API over HTTP, and you just provide the payload in the format it needs, and in your receiving end you can just do a get, and you just do in the same way. You just give it what it needs, and you get what you need. So that way it is compatible across different platforms and different languages, and it is also secure in the sense that you can add your own authorization ways. You can for instance, like the way this particular project have been implemented is using an authorization solution called Auth0, but that is just one of the many. You can implement any of the other authorization and authentication methods available. So those are some of the advantages of REST API. And coming to Flask-RESTPlus, so RESTplus is basically an extension to REST. It makes building REST APIs pretty easy, and one of the major strengths of Flask-RESTplus is that it uses it is built on top of the pluggable views. It provides resources as a building blocks, the basic building blocks. So what it means is that you don't have to write for, usually if you code REST APIs, you have to define, okay, for this particular endpoint I want this particular action, I want a get. Then you code all the values for that, all the logic for that, and then you design, okay, for the same endpoint I have this particular one. You code that as a separate method. In REST API, in Flask, you code every single in Flask, every single endpoint and every single action on that particular endpoint is a separate method. You code it that way. But with Flask-RESTplus, you handle the whole thing as a class. You define a class, and then you define the methods inside that class. So it is easy for you to just add have an endpoint and add any number of methods inside that endpoint. So that is one of the major advantages of Flask-RESTplus. And you can also have multiple methods on a single endpoint. For instance, I have two endpoints, and one of them has I can code the get and the put, get and the post on the same endpoint in the same method in the same class. So and another advantage of Flask-RESTplus is that it comes with very good response marshalling. So basically what it means is that you can define what sort of inputs and what sorts of outputs you want. You can specify the input and output data models, and it would adhere to that model. You don't have to spend a lot of time thinking about validations. Okay, all sorts of like this is an integer field. What if the user enters a character, stuff like that. So it basically does a pretty good response marshalling. You can specify what format your data has to be in, and you can specify what format the data that you get would be in. So all that can be specified pretty easily, and any change you make, for instance, you have an integer field, you want to make that as a character field, it's just a simple change and that gets reflected immediately. You don't have to do a lot of work for simple changes. You can concentrate on the actual logic of your code, actual logic that your API needs, rather than spending time at trimming the ends and dotting the i's and crossing the t's. So the other thing is request parser. So there are two things about that. So what it can do is, like, one is as I said, validate the form data. So it would say, like, you can specify, okay, for this particular endpoint and for this particular method, I need I can accept the four arguments. For instance, let us say I can get age, I can get the size, I can get the page. You can have a list of arguments you can accept for it, and then you can choose to make only some of them as required parameters, rather than making all of them as required or all of them as optional. And it takes just a few words of code to implement that. So that is another advantage of using that. And the last but not least, it has a very good integration with the Swagger documentation. So Swagger documentation is basically documenting your API. So for instance, usually APIs, you need to have a source and a destination to show how an API would work. But if you would like to show demo the API to somebody, say your manager, or to even the team members or anybody, you can use the Swagger documentation to show what the different methods can do and what the different data types these methods expect and produce, and what sample values can be. And you can even plug the data. You can actually use the logic to run the API. We can see more of these later. So more on Swagger documentation. The most prominent feature about Swagger documentation is documentation is usually human readable. It can also be machine readable, in the sense that you can add your own, like, Postman scripts to make sure that these to run tests. So you can do both of them with Swagger documentation, and it is easy to demonstrate the API to others, and you can add model definitions. You can add definitions about in particular individual fields. All those can be done pretty easily. So that is the advantages of Swagger documentation. We can get a little closer into the different features of the RESTplus. So the first thing would be the model schema. Before going into all the different parts of it, I'll show you the overall. This is the Swagger documentation. So you can just this is connected to the API that I am now running. So this is local, and I have a Postgres server running locally. So you can specify what is the name of your application, and you can add descriptions to the application, and you can list operations. You can tell, like, okay, these are the endpoints, and these are the operations on the different endpoints. So you can have all those. And another advantage of RESTplus is it is easy to version your API, and you can show what version it currently is in the Swagger documentation. And so you can expand the operations, and it will give you all sorts of information. like this is the model schema. For example, if you do a get on the audience endpoint, you would be getting a data that is in this format. So it would have an audience, and it would have a client ID, and that would be an integer. You'd have a date timestamp, you would have a string called deep link, and you'd have a string called name. So all those it would tell you, and it would also like let you add, it would also let you query that particular endpoint with the parameters that you specified as required and optional in RESTplus. And coming to the post, it would tell you like, okay, if you want to try the post method on the any particular endpoint, it would give you option to it would show you the sample model schema. Okay, this is the format your model has to be, and it would let you have this. If you click on this, it would copy this to you, and you can edit it to suit your input, and you can run this. And basically this is it would also give you the different response messages that are possible. For instance, I can say I can return 400 for any invalid page number or invalid page size. I can define all this in RESTplus. I can say like, if usually when we get 404, we get the generic page not found. We can collect that, and we can define on what we should respond, what we should provide the user when any response code has to be sent out to them. So for this particular endpoint, a 404 would return audience not found, and a 400 would return an invalid page number or an invalid page size, depending on what the issue was. So all these can be set using RESTplus and Swagger. So I just tried it out. I just submitted a GET request to the audience endpoint, and what I get is the list of audiences. So as it said, it is in the same format that was defined in the model schema. So you can see that, and I can see, if you notice, the client ID parameter is, I didn't specify that, so that is an optional parameter. You can still code it to add. So right now, if you see, it has all sorts of client IDs, client ID 10, client ID 0. But if you want to filter it, you can just say 10, and that is going to filter it with just the client ID is 10. So you can code all this logic into RESTplus. Although the logic of handling this is the same like we do in any Python program, the way it handles it is pretty easy. We don't have to worry about how to make this compatible with Flask, how to make this get reflected in Flask, how to make sure what we did is pretty clear to the others who are viewing this documentation. All those are taken care of by RESTplus and Swagger. So getting into the code, here is how we can. So the basic structure is this. So I have an app here, and so I basically define a Flask, and I can link it to the SQL Alchemy. I can create a DB with SQL Alchemy, and I can do all the definitions here. So I have defined all my tables in a separate model file. And there is another, this is the, so one thing about it is like I can version it. So let us say I want, this is the first version 1. I can write the whole logic here. And if I want to write a version 2, I can write another, I can create another v2, and I can write the logic for the version 2, and I can just import that. So for instance, here is the v1, and that is I'm using Blueprint to version it. So I'm in the main app init, I'm just importing v1. So now it is going to run the version 1 of the API. I can create another version 2 and I can write the whole logic behind it, and I can mark that as v2, and I can import that v2 here and run the API. It is going to run the version 2 of the API. So it's pretty straightforward in that. So for the first feature, so the first feature we are going to see is defining the model schema. So this is how we define the so this is how we define the model schema. For instance, I can say this is the audience list format, and that is going to be a model with a name, fields.string, and it has a description, and it has a field that says if it is required or an optional field. And I can define also all the different fields in the audience list that is going to be returned by the get. And finally, when I am done with the whole model, I am just going to use that model here. So here is the API.route of audience, and for the get, I am going to use the so I'm just going to use the
it was right above.
Yeah.
First line.
Yeah. So I'm just going to use the audience list model. So it is going to be for 200 for the success, it is going to return the audience list model. So that is what is going to be returned. And for the post, so that is for audience. So this is API.response, and this is for the get method that is going to return to you the data in this particular specified format. For the post, though, you would have to enter data, you would have to provide data to the API, and that has to be in a specific format, and you would have to enforce that. And for that, you define the audience list model, and you define the audience input model, and that audience input model is here. You specify it. This the input to this post should have a name in as a string, and it should have a client as an integer. So you specify all the different fields and their data types, and you just say .expect. So if we say API.expect of audience input, it is going to expect the data in this format only and in this data type only. If it is going to stray from this data type, it is going to throw out an error, and that is not going to break the API. So that is going to still the API is still going to continue. Even if you provide any invalid inputs to it, it is going to still continue running. So that is a great advantage of using this. And you also have the API.response, wherein you can specify the output model. So that is another, again, what so audience post output is. You are just going to say, like, if you post a new audience, it is just going to say audience created, and this is the URL for the created audience. So you can specify all the different models, all the different schema for different models, and you can make it, you can just say API.expect, and it is going to enforce that particular model. So this is the, again, the next thing is the endpoints and methods. So here you have the you define the different routes. Routes are the endpoints. So here I have two routes, audience and audience slash a string with the audience ID. So I can define different routes, and those are the endpoints. And inside each route, I define a class, and I can add any number of methods inside that class. For instance, I can define both get and post within the audience within this audience endpoint. Usually with REST API, you would have to define audience and get as a separate method, and audience and post as a separate method. This just collects all the different methods inside a single endpoint in a single place. And you can also define what responses you want. For instance, usually so you can define, okay, if I get a 200, I'm going to say it is a success, and I am going to return the value in this particular format. So API.response, you can just say API.response, and you can catch all the different response codes you want, you expect the API to provide and API to throw out, and you can add your own messages to all of them, including the output format. So for instance, here I say for 201 I am going to say audience saved, and I am going to post the output in this particular format. If it is a 400, I am going to say bad request. So all this I can say, and I can even say like custom responses. For instance, let us say something is missing, and I can say like I can catch that, and I can say this particular thing is missing, and I can return a 400. I can raise a 400 on demand instead of waiting for it to raise it automatically. So all those are pretty straightforward as compared to the vanilla Flask. So that is a major advantage of Flask-RESTplus here. And finally, you can add any type of authorizations. So in this case, I am using auth0 as I said earlier. But anything, all you need to have for authorization is basically you need to have an authorization header, and here in the beginning you specify what you do it. So you say authorizations. So this is the parameters. This is the this is all the options for the API. So you say this is the version 1, and this is the title of the API, and this is going to get authorized using the authorizations header, and it is going to have a bearer type security, and this is the description for the API. So now that you have defined this, you can just say okay. So you can say API.header is authorization, and that would be a JWT token, and it would be a required field. So in that if you specify that API.header, and if you say it is a required field, it would not let you pass any query. It would not let you run any query onto the endpoint without a header. And you can add your own logic based on the authorization authorization logic you use. You can add your own way of handling that.
Could you move that to the class, that decorator to the class level if you wanted it to be in effect for everything underneath that class?
This one?
Or
Yeah.
Does the header have to go with the go method?
Yeah, you just do it. You just do it for the different endpoints. You can either do it at the class level, or you can do it at the different endpoints. So you can say like I want them to have an authorization to access the post part, but I don't need them to have an authorization for the get part. So you can specify authorization for different endpoints, and that's a cool thing to do too. And you also say API underscore requires underscore auth. I think this is something that is tied to auth0, so it might differ for the different authorization methods. But other than that, you can also document the different parameters. So here, you can say like these are the parameters for my for the endpoint, and it is going to have an audience ID. It is going to be taken inside the audience underscore ID field. It is going to be, there's going to be a page number, and that is going to be inside the page variable. So you can specify all that, and that would get reflected here. So you can say like page number, page size, audience ID. So if you say remove any of these or modify any of these, you just save this, and it's immediately there. You don't have to worry about, you don't have to wait for it. It's immediately there. And you can specify some of them as required. So by default, you don't even have to specify the main thing as I never specified audience ID as a required field, but since the endpoint expects an audience ID, so this is the audience / audience ID endpoint root, and since I am using a get of self audience underscore ID, it automatically made audience underscore ID as a required field. It wouldn't excuse me, it wouldn't let you query that without an audience under audience ID. So you can also make any of the other parameters, any of the other arguments as required or not required very simply. So all these are the different features. So for instance, here I can say so if I run it with this, it is going to give me all the details about that particular audience. If I make any mistakes with any of these values, so I have so if I say like I am going to make it as D, it is going to give me an error. It's going to say errors page invalid literal for integer you have specified, and if you have specified a string, and input payload validation failed. So basically it is validating the payload even before it hits the server. It validates it at the API level. So that is a great thing because it doesn't crash or it doesn't kill the server. The server is still available, the server is still up and running. So you fix this and it's going to immediately run. You don't have to write any logic to handle this thing. You just have to say that this particular argument is going to be a number. That's what it takes. It handles everything in the back end. So that is a good thing about RESTplus and Swagger. So do you have any other specific questions, or would you like to see anything more on this?
How many built-in modules are you using, and how many third-party modules are you using that are not built into the Python environment?
So just bring up your requirements.
Yeah. So are you asking me about RESTplus, or are you asking about this particular whole project as a whole?
That particular project.
Okay.
The authentication.
So these are all the projects. These are all the packages that we use: Flask-RESTplus, SQL Alchemy to handle the Postgres, and PsychoPG2 for the Postgres stuff as well. Talks to handle the installation and setting up the virtual environment. Nose for the nose tests. JWT to handle the auth0 stuff. And
Any token.
yeah.
JSON.
That's it.
So I'm looking at the documentation and I'm looking about authorization, and it says that the authorization is a Swagger dictionary specification of the authorization. Are you familiar with configuring authorizations of different types like OAuth 2 and etc., so that you use another site for your authorization on your RESTful API?
We can definitely do that. Just that I have chosen to use auth0, and in fact for the next versions of the API we are going to move over to a different authorization, just because auth0 has the initial setup on their own server, initial validation on their own server. So we would like to move on to something that we have within our control. So that's definitely possible with RESTplus. So the configuration that you talk about is like that is the Swagger definition. You just say like which particular field has the authorization information. So it is going to take that that particular piece of information and pass it over to the authorization logic.
Okay. The other question I have is I've seen a lot of frameworks that when the server is running the back end to display or run the API, it will take changes. Like you'll be in the editor and you'll make a change and hit save, and that hot edit will trigger the server back end to look at the file updates. And it didn't look like there was a parameter for that. Do you know whether there is or not? just a nice function for.
So, I mean, like, for example, he's using PyCharm. If you were using PyCharm, it'll automatically reload your Flask application as you make changes and save.
So is it the server watching the files, or is it what? I don't know what PyCharm is. So PyCharm is like an Atom-based.
Is your editor.
I'm using
Yeah.
Visual Studio Code.
Okay, all right.
I think it does too. I think it understands what Flask is, and it probably.
Yeah.
has the
Yeah,
same-
I probably have to install something to say it's a Flask project, and then it will.
But if not, if you're like, in this case, if it's managed by a Green Unicorn in production or whatever, you actually have to basically restart that process if you're making changes, right? And it's not automatically going to know anything about that. But typically, at any rate, if you were deploying that in a production environment, you'd probably create a new server.
Oh no, this would be DevOps.
and
I'm
then,
just
you know,
Yeah.
convenience and.
So for dev, like if you notice, like I showed something about modifying a page number to page NO, and I didn't even stop and restart the server. I just made the changes and I saved it. It is going to. You can see the run logs. Or I can just make a change right now and show you. So right now this is running, and if I make any changes to anything here,
You just change the version. Bump it by 0.1.
of which one?
The version, your API version, bump it by 0.1.
Yeah, I just I just at least like I can just reload undo the change that I did previously. I can still make the change of the version. I can make the change here. It's not going to. I can say it's 2.5.1, and if I save this, this is going to say.
So you detected change, words.
Yeah, it says detected change in the file, reloading, restarting with stat, settings loaded. So it automatically restarted the server.
Actually, in this case, it's actually WordZig, which is part of Flask, that automatically detected it. When you're running in development mode or debug, basically that's what you're running. If you were running in a normal environment, you wouldn't have that though. So that's why it's doing that. So it should work in Visual Studio also.
So when I started it, if Flask REST API was running, it says debug is active, and I hit the save button, it did not restart the server. That's why I asked. So I don't know, it probably may need a trigger on, something. It's just a nice feature for developers that we've gotten used to. The other thing, you mentioned Swagger, and have you shown any of the Swagger tool set being integrated with this? Is it innately integrated, or do you have to, how do you get the model out of the Flask REST API into the Swagger tool set?
Swagger is innately integrated to it. You don't even have to import anything Swagger. You just import Flask-RESTplus, and anything you don't even have to actively document anything. The Swagger page is automatically created. Even if you don't provide any of the documentation strings, documentation parameters, it's still going to document the whole thing. The Swagger page would be ready as soon as your API is ready. That is an inbuilt integration.
Okay, so I'm looking at the main page. You say
So your API itself, once you create your API, when you have an option of specifying, by default I think it's on the root, but you can also specify the path at which it'll answer your documentation, basically.
Are there any other questions?
I wonder, how are you able to update the quit time?
Or the QuickTime?
Yeah, how are you able to keep it updated now?
Are you talking about the recording?
The whole app. Because I heard they're not going to, the quit time and not going to update it and there's a vulnerability? If I'd known that, I wouldn't have uninstalled it.
Oh, I have. This is the first time I'm using it. Francois is the one you should be asking this question to.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I didn't.
Yeah,
Hmm.
I read about that.
I do have one question. So, considering this was a totally different project than normally what you would do, and so even though I mean you started on this project not knowing anything about Flask-RESTplus or Flask, right?
That's right.
So how easy was it for you to get into it?
The thing about that is like when I started this project, I hardly knew a lot about REST. I just knew the basics about REST, and I had built some basic Flask sites, but nothing complex, just some demo Flask sites, but nothing about RESTplus, and this is something that I had never heard about, but I was still able to get up and running within 2 weeks. The API was up and running within 2 weeks. Of course, I added more and more features as the days went by, but the basic API itself was up within 2 weeks for a complete beginner for a complete newbie to this one. So that is the greatest thing. That is the thing that I really liked about RESTplus. It's that it's really simple and it makes things that are usually complicated or things that usually need more attention. It just takes your attention away from all of those and puts it right into where it has to be, the main logic of your API. And anything beyond that, any other infrastructural changes or infrastructural updates you need to make, those are all done by RESTplus, and those are pretty seamless.
How long have you been using now?
This I've been using this for the past, I would say, like five months.
Okay. So the follow-up question then is, very often something that's really, really easy to get started, not long after that you figure out that, but once you want to do this thing, it's tough because,
Right.
kind of a trade-off.
Definitely.
Have you found that with this, or what kinds of?
I've to be frank, I've never faced any such thing like that. I initially had some questions, so is it possible with this? But then I looked into the documentations, and the thing about Swagger documentation, Swagger is not just limited to RESTplus. It is its own project. RESTplus has just integrated Swagger. So even the things that I couldn't find out on RESTplus documentation regarding the Swagger part, I could find it on Swagger, and I could relate to it. If of course it was not exactly the same, but I was able to relate the same thing, and I could get it working. So so probably the documentation might be a little lacking in some cases, in some special cases, but the capacity is here, the capability is here.
Welcome to open source. As an aside, swagger.io kind of defines the Swagger format, and it's kind of cool. They even have a live editor where you can write the API in English more or less, and it'll generate a framework for you to actually fill out. Neat project.
Okay, well then that brings me to a question, which is, so Flask and Flask-RESTplus are obviously very Python centric. Is Swagger Python centric, or is it used for?
No,
No.
initially it was more of a Node project. So,
Okay.
and it's actually now the official name is Open API Documentation. Is what it's called.
So what's okay? Well, given that, then what part is Swagger, I guess, and what part is RESTplus in terms of?
Swagger is the it's basically the JSON format to specify your documentation, and the Swagger UI is what you are seeing there, which is the interaction that you can do within your documentation. It's almost like a Jupyter Notebook kind of deal, where you have cells and you can enter stuff and interact with it. So that's yet another piece of that. Versus the Flask-RESTplus. Well, RESTplus is basically a full REST, because out of the box, Flask is not really designed for REST APIs, right? I mean, it's more for building web applications. And so, but it gives you the class-based REST, get, put, post, and so on and so forth. Anyway, if you look at the RESTplus page, he specifically highlights some of the enhancements that, basically going down. I mean, before RESTplus, you had RESTless and RESTful, Flask-RESTful and Flask-RESTless, which were basically full introspecting of your database and building a CRUD API on top of it, versus the other, which is for specifying your actual APIs and building them a more manual way. And so RESTplus just removes a few of the pain points that were still left on the other Flask modules.
But that server that's actually serving those forms that let you, explore the API, that's part of RESTplus, right?
What it's doing, it's actually, so the Swagger UI is actually gigantic.
Is it on JavaScript?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
All right, I get it now.
Yes. You can, tweak the appearance with CSS and so on and so forth.
So therefore, it'd be that same JavaScript whether someone was doing a Node-based REST server or Python-based REST server.
Right.
Okay.
Which other how does this compare to other frameworks which you've used?
So I haven't used many other frameworks. As I said, I was pretty much new to REST. And not terribly familiar with Flask. So I haven't used a lot of frameworks. I did the basic analysis on the different frameworks, and the thing that attracted me to Flask was the inbuilt Swagger documentation, because that was something that we wanted to that we had to have. We had to be like within a couple of weeks we had to be able to show us, we do sprint demos, and we had to be able to show the stakeholders what we have ready, what we have worked on. And instead of working on a separate task to bring up the whole thing, documenting the whole thing, this was done automatically. So that was something that attracted me to RESTplus. But I'm pretty sure there are pros and cons to all the different frameworks, but I haven't worked a lot with others.
That's fine.
Yeah.
That's a good answer. I was just curious.
What problem are you most proud of solving while working with Flask?
Getting the authorization part of it, that was one of the issues I had, and that was one of the places where the documentation was not pretty clear about it, and there were also some issues with the auth0 part of it. So there and a lot of the other parts of getting the handling the different errors, like for instance handling the different page not found and stuff like that, the custom responses and the logic behind having the custom responses. So that was something that was pretty interesting to do, given the way it can be done. So that was something. If I have to say, like, overall the experience of putting this API together was a very fun experience.
If we can't find something in the documentation, do you recommend like we go to see something on YouTube, or should we just mess around with the syntax or the API while I'm there? Because you said like some of the documentation was it wasn't very clear.
It is for the most part, the documentation is really good. In that there are a lot of pieces that I haven't talked about, but they are discussed very. I mean, not in a deep dive, but they have given good examples. I can pull up the documentation for RESTplus. So you have documentations for endpoints, argument parsing. For instance, if you take argument parsing, it's going to talk to you about request parser, and you can tell about having it as a strict. So having it as a strict would so what this would basically do is, like, if you have declared 3 different arguments for your endpoint. So for instance, mine, I can specify the page number and the page size. If while sending the actual request, if I add something else, I say door number, something that is like irrelevant to the endpoint, it would not throw up any errors, or it would not even it would not get any validation errors also, because I have not made it strict. What I am going to do is, like, I am going to get all the information that I am getting, and I am going to validate if the whole bunch has what I want. You can specify strict equal to true, and that would say, like, this endpoint has only these 2 arguments defined. So you are not supposed to send any more arguments, and it is going to fail you. So there are so that is some of the things. There are things like this that are mentioned, or there are things like this all over the documentation that you can that I haven't used, but the documentation is really good. It's dense with information. So it talks about the different formatting. So, and you have like response marshalling and request parsing. So it talks about the model definition, and so the documentation overall is, for the most part, it is pretty good. So I didn't have to spend a lot of time looking for basic things or things that I needed for the API to work. But just a few edge cases I had to figure out how to get this done with RESTplus, and those were something to do with the Swagger part of it. And given that Swagger is a huge project on its own, I went into the Swagger documentation, and I was able to get the information and get this working. And since it is also based on Flask, you can also use the Flask documentation to get some idea of what it could be, because it is based on the Flask pluggable views. So you have everything, custom fields and multiple values. You can have URLs, you can have complex structures. This talks about how to define the complex structures and how to define the list fields. I have come across really sparse documentation, and compared to those, this is like really good. Any other questions?
Tell you it worked from its GitHub page. It said do this, do this, do this, and in 3 or 4 steps you get Flask REST API running on your laptop. So
yeah,
that's nice.
Yeah, nice. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.